have started each of these sessions with sort of a quick recap of the previous faucets we've covered. And since this is our 10th one, there are 9 previous faucets. So this portion of the presentation is getting longer and longer. But I think it's helpful to kind of touch on them because each of the Resilient Living Program do build off of one another. So it's helpful to kind of just go through these a little bit. And if you have questions, feel free again to ask. But the first faucet that we covered was emotional acknowledgement. So this is really one of the core, I think this and the ability to self-calm are sort of the foundation of the resilient living, or starting this practice of resilience. In order to be able to institute some of the more growth-based changes, you have to kind of sometimes start with the foundation and clearing out some of the junk in the attic, so to speak. So emotional acknowledgement is really about being aware of your emotional state and being able to name your feelings and to feel those feelings without judgment. So some of the harmful practices around emotional acknowledgement are stuffing our emotions, ignoring, or trying to talk ourselves out of those. And in this session, we discussed how that's really an unhealthy way to deal with emotions because it actually takes us in the opposite direction of what we want to do. By being able to acknowledge an emotion, you're actually diffusing some of the energy behind it. So when we stuff or ignore them, it kind of just holds that negative energy inside of us, and we're not able to release it. So being able to really acknowledge those is key. And then something we focused on in every session, and that's really important to remember, is that when we talk about stress or when we talk about resilience, it's important to know that, it's all unavoidable. Stress, different emotions, those are going to be a constant thing we experience throughout life. And so there's nothing we can do to prevent, certain stressors from happening, but we can be aware of how those stressors impact us. And so by making an effort to really, be aware of our emotions and stop them from driving some of our other actions or behaviors is a really key part of emotional acknowledgement. It's about not letting your emotions change your actions or how you treat other people or how you think in a negative way. One of the other things that we've seen or kind of explored in the 10 faucets is that many of these are connected and influence one another. So in the next recap about self-calming, we're going to see how these two faucets are really intertwined, and why part of emotional expressiveness is really that ability to calm ourselves down and acknowledge our emotions to process them most effectively. So what is self-calming about? It's really about being aware of your stress response and actively working to recover in the moment. So we've all probably experienced stressors and thought, I'm gonna take some self-care, I'm gonna decompress with this at one time. And most of the time, I think we tend to think, at the end of the week. But what we talked about with the ability to self-calm is that it's really important to do that in the moment as often as possible. We know that when we are stressed, our body is triggered into the fight, flight, or freeze response. And then there's a physiological chain of events or consequences in our body that happens when we enter this response. We discussed that it doesn't matter if it's a big or a little stress, that our body has that same reaction. So, frequent and continued exposure to that can have a real negative impact on our body. But one of the ways that is most effective at stopping this reaction is deep breathing. And so the analogy of, if we were a caveman being chased by a tiger, if we were to stop and take a few deep breaths, our body would question or would probably think, I don't need to be in this stress response state anymore, because if I was being chased by a tiger, I wouldn't be stopping to take these deep breaths. So deep breathing is really one of the quickest and most effective ways to help calm our nervous system and to help regulate our body. We also talked about flipping the lid and how when we are stressed, our upper and our lower brain disconnect, and that ideally in order to be able to think most clearly and use some of our higher functioning skills such as reasoning and problem solving, we need to close that lid. And so self-calming is really key to being able to use all those higher functioning skills that help us solve our problems and ultimately end or sometimes avoid further stressors. And then we also discussed mirror neurons. So this is really important if you, especially if you're a parent, parenting a young child who's still learning these very key behaviors, or even if you're just a caregiver or a spouse to someone who, you know, is experiencing these stressors, that in order for us to truly be able to help them, we need to be able to model that calming behavior. So if we're trying to help someone else calm down, but we're still in that stress response state, it's going to be that much more difficult for them to truly be able to work on calming down. So it's really about, you know, sort of the air mask on the airplane, calming yourself down before you try to help others. And then lastly, we just reiterated that important point that, you know, you can't prevent stressful things from happening in life, but you do just want to bring yourself back from those stressful reactions and recover in the moment as quickly as possible. So then we moved on to talk about self-care. So this is sort of some of the basic practices that a lot of us are probably aware of when you think about, you know, self-care and being resilient or being able to recover from stress. It was the 3 core components of nutrition. Are we eating a healthy diet? Are we getting enough sleep and enough good quality sleep? And are we doing some sort of exercise or movement to help our body? So that's what we focused the majority of this session on. We did talk a little bit about some of the emotional self-care, but that was something we delved much more deeply into when we talked about the ability to self-replenish. But we did discuss in this session how self-care and self-compassion really go hand in hand. And to most effectively practice self-care, we really should try to come to that activity with the intention of meeting our own personal needs in that moment. So, you know, the more similar to self-calming and emotional expression, the more we can practice self-care throughout our day and incorporate it into our daily routine, the quicker and the more easily it becomes a part of our natural habit and sort of retrains our body to help it recover from the stress response process as quickly as possible. And from self-care, we started to launch into a little bit more of the philosophical or the components of resilience that are a little more based on our ideology and the commitments we make in life. So we talked about hardiness. And in hardiness, we discussed that the 3 C's, which are commitment, control, and challenge. And so commitment is really about giving it your best. It's about having involvement in areas of life like work, with your family or a religious group, or with our friends, and how that gives us meaning. And that those commitments and that meaning creates an importance and really adds purpose to our life. So that those relationships a lot of times are what can motivate us to put in more effort and create more of that goodness that we crave in life. And then we talked about control. So a lot of you may have heard of locus of control, and in this, you know, pertaining to hardiness with this faucet, we talked about how studies have shown that how much control we perceive we have over any stressor will influence how difficult that stressor will be for us to cope with. So, you know, if you have an internal locus of control or can focus on the things that are within your control, it makes it that much easier for you to adjust and to overcome life stressors. And so in that sort of same perspective, we discussed challenge and how being able to overcome those stressors was about not ruminating on the challenges that we can't fix. It was really about focusing on the things we can and not seeing every change or every difficulty as a total threat, but as something that was a growth experience for us to overcome. And then from there, we kind of went back to the self-care concept a little bit when we talked about the ability to self-replenish. So, you know, this is where we introduced here, you can see this invisible bucket on the right, or some people think of it as a gas tank. I'm really just using the analogy that, you know, we have to have this sort of inner reserve to be able to recover from stressors. So it's about learning to recognize when your tank or your bucket is becoming depleted and using, you know, your interests or different hobbies or things you can rely on to fill yourself back up. And so it's also really based, this faucet focused on how our interactions with others, the bucket and the dipper theory, really leans heavily on, you know, how every time you interact with someone, you're either filling up their bucket or you're taking away from their bucket. And that interaction has a similar effect on your own bucket. So, you know, when you have positive interactions with people, that not only benefits them, but it also benefits yourself. So those positive interactions with others are a really easy way to jumpstart replenishment, especially if you're in a negative situation where, you know, maybe there's someone who's causing some of this depletion in your tank. To initiate a positive interaction is a good way to kind of start to reverse the consequences that are going on there. So some of the things we talked about are just, you know, are you courteous to others? Do you share praise? Do you smile at people? You know, when you receive recognition, do you also give recognition? Little things like that are just practices that we can put into place to help increase our positive interactions with others. So from there, we moved on to one of my favorite facets, which is non-judgment and self-supporting thoughts. So this is really about being able to recognize when we're being overly harsh or critical with ourselves, and about some of the ways that we can rewire our brain's thought patterns and improve our self-talk to be more positive and growth focused. So in this session, we used the analogy of the sort of like rubber and glue. So our brain is like glue for the negative experiences that we have in life. And that's, you know, sort of an evolutionary characteristic that for us to be able to learn and sort of protect ourselves, we hang on to some of the negative experiences because we want to avoid those or learn from them. But for the positive experiences, our brain is sort of like rubber. They kind of bounce off because you don't have as much of an evolutionary benefit to hang on to those. And we discussed how that's actually, you know, really hard for someone to go through life always focusing on mistakes instead of holding on to the positive things. So perfectionism came into play a lot in this session when we talked about, you know, setting those unachievably high or unrealistic standards for ourselves and kind of getting stuck in that sense of judgment or blame when those standards aren't met. But a really critical part of kind of breaking down and letting go of that perfectionism is developing this awareness of our inner critic and being able to, you know, immediately challenge those judgmental thoughts as they come up. So we introduced the flip it exercise here as one strategy to create more supportive self-talk. And it really is just identifying again that critical self-talk and then identifying the parts of it that are untrue and kind of replacing them with a more constructive lens. And similarly, we also talked about gratitude practices here and how a practice of gratitude is a great way to start to kind of rewire our brain. And that segued really well into hope and optimism, which also has a lot of gratitude initiated into it. So for hope and optimism, we talked about, you know, optimism as being this belief that a situation will improve with the right time, resources, and effort. And again, we went on to that to identify that concept of that this isn't necessarily an easy thing for many of us to do, and the gratitude practices are one way we can start to counteract that. But that in addition to optimism, one must also have hope. That hope serves as this backbone for optimism because it provides a very concrete sort of steps for us to take to achieve or maintain that optimistic lens. So there are 3 aspects of hope, which are willpower, that is the ability to set goals, and then way power, which is our ability to develop smaller action steps or pathways to reach our goals. So it's not enough to just set a goal. We need to make it attainable by creating these, you know, sort of micro tasks to help break it down for us. And then follow through is the 3rd aspect, and that's really acknowledging that when we have goals, and you know, in any optimistic situation, we realize that it's not going to be all sunshine and roses, that there will be obstacles, but that when those obstacles come up, we will have the ability to stay flexible when things don't go as planned, to be able to identify barriers and then work around them. So hope and optimism pair really well together as sort of a follow-through mechanism. And then last month, we talked about sense of coherence. So this is also a favorite of mine. Sense of coherence is, there are these three components that make up the sense of coherence, and they are meaningfulness. So this is the belief that, you know, life makes sense and therefore coping is desirable. So this really plants a lot of our, you know, our own understanding of selves in a larger, you know, social good, so to speak. And so it is that, you know, we feel our lives have some sort of emotional meaning, and that is part of our reason for continuing to press on through whatever stressors we may face. The second aspect of sense of coherence is manageability. And that means that we have this understanding that there are resources that are required for us to be able to meet the demands of life. And so that when we do experience these stressors, we will seek out these different resources that we can use to overcome. And then thirdly, there's comprehensibility. So this is the belief that the world is understandable and meaningful, that there is some sense of order and consistency rather than just chaos and unpredictability. So we talked about some ways to increase sense of coherence. Action eases despair. So that, if you have ever heard the starfish story, you know, two individuals who are walking down the beach, miles of ocean and thousands of starfish have been washed up by the tide and are now dying in the sun. And one of the people reaches down every few steps and tosses one of the starfish back into the water. And after a while, the other person says, "There's so many, what you're doing doesn't make a difference." And the first person replies, "It makes a world of difference to the ones I pick up." So this is, you know, action eases despair is really, you know, a nod to the fact that every action, sort of like the bucket and the dipper theory, every action that we take does have a consequence. And so in these moments of intense despair, when situations feel so overwhelming, it's important for us to rely on the little actions that we can take. And then lastly, we examined a little bit of our core values and sense of coherence and how those things that we sort of pin our name to, or, you know, the things that are important to us in life are really, really critical in these stressful times, because that is really our why. And the saying is that if you know your why, you can figure out almost any how. So, you know, with that mission, it can help drive us to overcome the other stressors that we'll face. So that brings us to today, which is social support network. And I always feel a little silly doing this one with the FOP community, because especially coming off of the family gathering last week, I'm sure that you can all identify that we are so lucky to have such an amazing social support network in the online support groups that we have, and also just in all of the little one-to-one connections that I see existing in our community. So today's session isn't just about, you know, finding your social support network. It's really also about our responsibility as a member of that network to keep it healthy and strong. And so, you know, I would encourage all of you to think about what do you think a social support network is, and what do you value in yours? And, you know, just one way to kind of drive our conversation after the lecture, but also for you to think about what you're grateful for about it and what it is that would inspire or motivate you to maintain and work towards a continued healthy network. So a social support network is made up of friends, family, coworkers, and peers. And the key is that they really are there to support you in the good and the bad times. And that's a reciprocal relationship. So, you know, everyone within that support network has that shared sense of duty. And our social support network, any social support network, should be diverse. So just having one or two people cannot be your everything. That cannot be, you know, a strong and consistent network. And then for those social support networks to function effectively, they need to have an abundance of reciprocity between the supporter. So some of the benefits of a social support network, you know, they help to increase our sense of belonging, our safety, self-worth, self-esteem. Social support networks are found to help with depression, improve feelings of loneliness, and also improve physical health and chances of living a longer life, even for someone who has an existing illness. So it's not just something that, you know, we all get a warm and fuzzy feeling being with our peers or connecting with someone. There are real benefits to our long-term health with this. So how do we create a social support network? It's important, again, to reiterate that one person cannot be your everything. Your social support network should consist of a broader support network. So, you know, maybe you have a more immediate group, but then within your network, you should still be trying to sort of branch out and continue to establish relationships with people who are different from you, who are not necessarily in your sort of vetted and tried and true network. But within any social support network, this is turning into a little bit of a tongue twister, it is important to realize who are those key supporters. So there are, of course, always going to be those people that you'll come back to again and again, or who are sort of your first responders. And in developing or identifying those people, they should be non-judgmental. So we're going to talk about active listening a little bit and why that's really important. Compassionate and trustworthy. And then also, it's important, as I mentioned in the previous slide, to remember that that support should go both ways. So it's really, to have a healthy support network, important that you're a good supporter if you expect others to be there for you. So what are some of the ways that we can strengthen our support network? The first one is active listening. So this helps everyone become a better supporter. And active listening is listening attentively without trying to plan your response. That's really hard for most of us, I think. And it's really about trying to take in another person's perceptions. So it's identifying, you know, it's trying to come to an understanding of their beliefs and why they, you know, are sharing the viewpoints they share. A good way to kind of implement this active listening practice, if it's not something that you're already very good at, is to, you know, after you've made this attempt to listen without planning a response and to really take on their own perspective, the perspective of the person you're speaking with, is to reflect on what they said and kind of make a mental note. Remember what are the key details that person shared, and then think of how, you know, at a future date, you could follow up with that person, focusing on the key aspects of that conversation. And also in these social support networks, so in a conversation with, you know, someone who either you're supporting or they're there to support you, remembering to use open-ended questions to really encourage dialogue and not just try to get, you know, one specific answer that you may be looking for. Other ways to strengthen our social support network include calling friends, answering emails, texts. These are just little ideas for ways to continue to promote this factor, this faucet. So spending time and investing in relationships with people who are equally supportive. Challenging yourself by looking for ways you can improve and be more enjoyable to be around. I know that's kind of a hard one. No one likes to focus on their own faults, but you know, in all of our relationships, there's always ways for us to improve. So taking a few minutes to do that, showing appreciation, and then also just being proactive. So for the people who share your interests, you know, not necessarily being afraid or relying on them to initiate every social interaction, but taking the time to reach out and invite someone to do something. So in our relationships with others, we also want to take the responsibility of owning, you know, how we are sharing our emotions. So when we're coming to someone, we're reaching out to someone for support. There are sort of two different categories or ways that people do this. There's a dumper and there's a sharer. So the key difference is that a dumper does not take responsibility for their emotions. They expect others to be able to regulate for them. They may also expect others to solve their problems. A sharer is someone who realizes that the other person is someone with their own emotions. So you can see, you know, we talked about in the very first slide how a key aspect of this is the reciprocity. And so, you know, to be a good sharer in a conversation where you're coming to someone for social support, the real defining factor is that you're realizing that in the midst of your own pain, you're still impacting how you share, is still having an impact on someone else. And that can either be, you know, a very negative impact if you dump it all on them and expect them to handle the responsibility of your stress and of coming up with your solution. Or it can be that you come to that conversation with more of an ownership. So this is a video that I like to share. Just, I think it illustrates or highlights some of the differences between not necessarily a dumper or a sharer, but I guess the opposite of the person who's responding. So if you're someone who, you know, someone has come to you with a problem, do you respond with empathy or sympathy? And so we're going to watch this video, and then I think we'll be able to understand the concept a little bit more.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So I think that obviously gives us some guidance for moving forward and how to respond to people who are, you know, in experiencing a tough time. Oops. But it also raises an important point, which is that, you know, coming down into that hole and practicing empathy, which is more helpful for that person than sympathy, also comes at a cost to us. Because as it said, it requires us to go back to that sort of tough place. And so following up on that, this is actually a slide from last month's session where we talked about compassion versus empathy. and why, you know, as someone who maybe is experiencing stressors of their own, but is also obviously part of the support network and is there providing support for someone else, that sometimes we need to choose the compassionate route over empathy, more as a self-preservation method for ourselves. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of burnout or compassion fatigue. And so compassion fatigue is really, you know, when we put ourselves in this empathetic situation too much, that it starts to decrease and eliminate our own tank or our own reserves. So sometimes we do need to stay at the top of that hole and use a compassionate response, which is different from sympathy, but not necessarily put ourselves into that situation for someone else if we know that maybe we don't have the bandwidth to maintain or hold our own well-being in addition to supporting theirs. So what are some of the ways that we can sort of protect our own self-care in our social support networks? Because I think there's, you know, always someone who is someone you care about and someone who's a part of your network, but tends to be a little bit draining. It's important to think about, you know, what are those relationships that are draining for you? And it's important to give yourself that permission to set boundaries and realize that, you know, you don't always have to pick up the phone. And that there are some relationships that ultimately you may have to let go of to sort of preserve this, you know, self-care for yourself. And then, you know, think about, have there been times when you're at this threshold where you can't reach out and respond to certain people, and just knowing that that's okay, that, you know, emotional expression, self-calming, self-replenishment, those are all there to help play a huge part in your ability to provide that social support when you can. But things to be aware of in setting these boundaries or in some of the relationships that may be problematic are, you know, are there people who have unhealthy behaviors or who have relationships with you where there are always strings attached? Are there some of your relationships which are more of a one-way street? Someone's always taking, and never giving. So those are the questions that or some of the thoughts that I wanted to review for us today. But I do have some discussion questions. So, you know, if you are all still free to